Here we go. Thank you so much. This is going to be so much fun. And are you in Nacogdoches right now?
I am. I'm in my study upstairs in Nacogdoches, well, outside the country, outside of town. But yeah, I'm close to Nacogdoches. We'll call it Nacogdoches. We call it Big Bear Manor.
Big Bear Manor. How did it get that name?
My wife's nickname is Bear.
Oh, okay. That's awesome. Well, all right. Preston, you ready?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Are you ready, Joe?
Oh, yeah, I was born ready.
Jason born ready. Perfect.
Well, there's that too, I guess.
All right. Welcome to my bloody podcast. Have a great show today. I'm Bryan Kluger. I'm with Preston Barta, and we have a legendary, an intercontinental champion of the pen, of the paper, of the screenplays, novels, and novellas, all the way in East Texas. Joe Landsdale, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We are going to talk about so much in the horror genre, your upcoming appearance in Dallas, Texas at the Texas Theater. We have so much to cover, but first, like in The Sound of Music, we have to start at the very beginning. In East Texas, Joe, in East Texas, what got you into writing? What were you a little kid reading books, comics? How did this all start?
Well, when I was 4 years old, my brother's 17 years older than me. And so he was out of the house. So we always kid with that we were both only children because we were raised as only children. And I came along 17 years later. So, I was like still a kid. And when he was married, his wife, my sister-in-law, Mary Louise, she decided that she would impress the family and bring me a stack of comics. And then she had to read them to me. And then she would get tired of reading them to me. So I started memorizing them when she would read them. And then after a while, she just said, well, you just need to learn to read. And my mother started teaching me how to read. But it's funny. It was like, as soon as I saw those comic books and I saw that their stories, I wanted to write. I wanted to tell stories. I don't know if I thought of it as writing, and I certainly didn't think of it as a career, but I wanted to tell stories. And so I wanted to write and draw. And when I was a child, at about 6 years old, I was considered kind of like an amazing artist. And by the time I was 8 years old, I was still the same artist. By the time I was 12 years old, looking back, I wasn't very good at all. I was just doing okay for a 6-year-old. And but the stories got better. And I got more interested in telling the stories. And I liked that better. It satisfied me more. But comic books were what made me bite originally. And I loved Batman, for instance, and Justice League and so all the comics that were starting to thrive, many of them under Julie Schwartz's, oversee period there when he was the top editor dog. And years later, he became a friend of mine. So I always thought that was kind of weird. There I was as a child reading these comics that he edited. And there was another comic called Classics Illustrated, which was famous novels and short stories done up as comics. And I got interested in those, and that led to me reading all kinds of writers, some of them right about that time, but many of them later, because I remembered those comics and I kept them for a long time. In fact, I don't really know what happened to them. I have a few stray ones about, like cats. I come across them every now and then. But that made me want to do it more, and then reading made me want to do it more. And by the time I was 9, I had written my first book, which was mostly plagiarism that I had done for myself. And I did write an original poem. And I thought, wow, I don't like poetry, but that was fun. I came to like poetry a little better as I got older, and my prose has some poetic aspects, but I really thought, you know what, I want to write. And then when I read Edgar Rice Burroughs when I was 11, I no longer wanted to write. I had to write. And I started trying to write stories. I did write a story and a play for school, and I worked on a couple of novels for years and years. I could just never get past that. I got past the middle part, but people just seemed to kind of malinger. Events just kept happening, and no ending was in sight. I had no understanding of story arc at all. But I was going, I wanted to do it. And I started reading Everybody and His Dog. Even when I was living in Mount Enterprise, we didn't have a library because I was born in Gladewater, moved there when I was a kid, and we didn't have a library there. And they had a bookmobile, and I think it was just in the summers. And I would read books, and there was another kid that didn't like to read, and so he would go with me and let me pick books from him, and then I would take his books home and read them, and then I would turn them all in when the bookmobile was coming back, and I just became fanatic for reading and trying to write. And I guess when I went to college, then of course, then I started reading a lot of more classic writers of Fitzgerald and Hemingway. I'd read Hemingway actually because my mother had saved all of these old, I think they were Look magazines, and The Old Man and the Sea was actually in the magazine. That's where it first appeared. And I read it there, and I remember being disappointed because he didn't get the fish. But when I started going to college, it had a different ring to it when I read it. And I read The Great Gatsby and Diamond as Big as the Ritz and Steinbeck stories and stuff. And that led me going to the university library, or college library, actually. It was a 2-year college, and finding all of these writers that I had read and reading more, so that I had a pretty good education in at least Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Steinbeck, Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor. Flannery O'Connor I read more of later, but all of those people combined. And, nobody ever said to me, don't read science fiction, don't read genre fiction. So I read it all. I didn't know that one was supposed to be better for me than another, and I'm influenced by both. I'm very much influenced by the prose, and sometimes the character insight, and sometimes the story insight in those literary works. And then the genre fiction taught me how to just tell a story. And I love them both. And the collision of those things has a lot to do with my career. So in a way, since I was 4 years old and I'm going to be 72 in October, I've been a storyteller in between all kinds of rotten jobs.
That's amazing. I have to go back when you said you were an illustrator and you draw. Do you still draw, or did your parents or you keep any of your drawings in like frames or anything?
I still doodle now and then, but I always destroy them afterwards. I was looking at some of John Lennon's doodles, and I thought, damn, if that's good, I'm a genius. But no, I mean, my mother was a painter, on her own. That wasn't her way she made a living. She did it because she liked doing it, and she sold her paintings. But my father couldn't read or write. He was illiterate. And so it was a totally weird thing there, because my mother was always pushing me to read, and my dad was always supporting it, because he was saying, you don't want to end up like me, not knowing how to read and write, because he was born in 1909 and his mom died when he was 8. And he used to get a horse whipping to go out and work in the cotton fields, make him go out and work when he's 8 years old. One time he fell off a horse and busted, because they were still going, when horse fell off a horse, busted his eardrum, and his father beat him with a horse whip, made him go back. And many years later, my uncle, which is his younger brother, said when I guess my dad was, I don't know, 17, maybe a little older, I think about that age. He said his father pulled the horse whip off the wall and was going to beat his younger brother, Leonard. And my dad took it away from him and said, nah, you've whipped us for the last time. And he said, and they left and never came back, So my dad was a tough guy too. He grew up in, my mother was born probably, I think about 1914 or 15. I'm not sure exactly. And she and he became young adults during the Great Depression. And my dad worked for the WPA, and he used to, from time to time, ride the rails to carnivals and box and wrestle in carnivals. And he was sort of the beginning of professional wrestling, which was being developed. He didn't know that. And most of the people involved did not know that. But that's what was happening. And he was good. He was my first martial arts instructor, which I still do that. I have a school here in Nacogdoches, and I still teach private lessons.
That's amazing, and I'm glad the start of pro wrestling, because I'm a big pro wrestling fan. Being in Dallas, the Sports Stadium, I used to go there.
Yeah, I never really liked it. My dad liked it, watch it on TV, but I loved boxing and real wrestling, and I'm not saying those guys aren't athletes, because they're incredible athletes, but I didn't like all of the, the silly pomp and circumstance, it
The
was too much like
the theatrics.
yeah, too much like a stage play done by 9-year-olds. And so I didn't really like all that.
That's right,
But I
Brian.
got interested in judo and jujitsu, and I was fortunate in the right place at the right time when I was able to get into those things a little later. But but I think that my parents both being encouraging, and we were, poor. My father used to say if it cost a quarter to ship, we'd have to throw up. And I think he was right. We wouldn't have a lot of money. And so in time, I just kept thinking, I don't just want to write. I want this as a career, because I began to understand what a career was as, I got older, but I had no idea how to do it. I never met a writer, a publisher, an agent, another writer. I never met anybody that was interested in what I was doing, living out in the wilds of East Texas. I didn't know what to do or how to get started. My wife had a lot to do with that. When I met her, that turned that in a better direction. I think I would have eventually made it, because I don't know that I wanted to ever do anything else besides that in martial arts. But she certainly solidified it and put me in a position where I could do it. I mean, I worked, she worked, but she once gave me 3 months off to do nothing but write. And she said, but when I come home, you better have something written. And she was working in a freezer truck, packing it with lunch meat. And so she gave me 3 months, and every day I'd write a story every day for 90 days. And back then you could send a story out to 10, 15 markets. It didn't like now. There were magazines, and nearly every magazine ran fiction. Now, a lot of not knowing what I was doing, I found I think it was the Writer's Digest magazine that gave me some tip on how to, send things out. And I think first thing I sent out was in longhand before I realized you couldn't do that. And then my wife had a typewriter. She used to say I married her for a typewriter. She had a manual Montgomery Ward's typewriter. We had back then, we had the paper you put in the carbons, you've got ribbons, and and whiteout. I needed a gallon of whiteout. I couldn't spell. I'm terrible at spelling back then, especially. And I was a messy typist too, but I could type fast, but not necessarily accurate. And so I would write a story a day, and then and finished. I mean, I would clean them up. So I back then I didn't know what I was doing. So I'd spend all day. I'd write the story about half a day. By the time, and she would come home for lunch, and I would show, look, see, story. And then when she'd leave, I would polish it up as best I knew how and send it out. And over those 90 days, I wrote 90 short stories, and I sent them out to all those markets. And of course, they kept coming back because they were just god awful. And over a period of 4 years, because it took that long to go through all of these different, magazines and stuff, I got 1,000 rejects. Literally, we used to joke about that paper in the wall. We really could, we had that many. I say we because we were partners, but I couldn't believe that I could turn out copy that fast. But I'd already been selling, by the way. I'd been selling nonfiction before I even tried to write that. The very first thing I ever wrote was with my mother, and we sold it to Farm Journal as by Orita Landsdale or Orita Wood. I forget which name she used, maybe used her maiden name. And then on top of that, we got paid for it and won a prize as best article. So I thought, damn, I like this. So I sold some more articles, some for money and some for copies, and then I went into trying to write fiction, which was considerably more difficult. And that 90 days that she gave me was a turning point, because I got all the crap out of my system. I got all of the stories I had read, all the Alfred Hitchcock magazines, and all of the Alfred Hitchcock Presents on TV, and the Twilight Zone and Outer Limits, and Terra, which was an earlier show with Boris Karloff as the MC. But I some of that stuff seeped in, and I was just getting it all out, and I'd read everybody in science fiction, and I read tremendous amount of science fiction. I read other things, but what I had really wanted to be when I was growing up was a science fiction writer. And I think that it began to waver a little bit after college, because I saw that there was such a variety of fiction. And then once I read Raymond Chandler, I thought, well, you know what? I think I could write a crime novel. And eventually I wrote a few, and well as a lot of horror short stories, and I guess a few novels that might be called that. Now, I know that's a long way of getting to answering your question. But if you don't want to know, don't ask.
I loved it.
When you were talking about your parents, by the way, I can see why you're a storyteller. Both Bryan and I don't mind you sharing everything about your life story. That has me interested as you were talking about, your parents growing up. As you were saying it, there was like a cinematic quality to it. I was picturing everything as you were describing it. And so it has me curious as to how much you've weaved your growing up into your own work, specifically your parents.
Tremendously. I'm writing a memoir right now, and it's maybe not always the truth, but it's the truth as you remember it. You think it's the truth, but what's funny is a few times I've asked people about something, they had a totally different take on those events, and I just decided they were wrong, wrote it my way. But I've always, and movies were a big influence. I love TV movies. Well, they were showing old movies on TV, and when I was growing up, I was born in 51, and TV was really just starting to be a thing. It had been around, but there really was no programming per se. And they started buying a lot of old things like Hopalong Cassidy movies. And the guy, William Boyd, who had played Hopalong Cassidy in those, was smart enough to buy the television rights, which everybody thought was silly and was a fad. He sold his house and lived in a trailer. And then Hopalong Cassidy became, and they started making new episodes, for TV, became like the Beatles were later. People were just crazy. There was Hopalong Cassidy stuff everywhere. And a famous story about Hopalong Cassidy that made me love him even more was that William Boyd was at a signing, and they had in the South, they had black kids over here in this line, white kids in this line. And he said, if you don't put those two lines together, I'm gone. Hopalong Cassidy caused them to put the two lines together. You didn't see that much in the South. That's the kind of power that he had. And I really admired that. I never got that story. And but anyway, I was watching all these old movies, horror movies, Universal, and a little later they started putting some of the older Corman style movies, some of them even before Corman. And then later I was seeing all these things, and some of that stuff was so bad it was good. And some of it was bad, but I didn't know it was bad because I had nothing to measure it against. Back then, if you liked fantasy, science fiction, or weird, you grasped at straws. Everything seemed worth seeing that had any element of that. And then you had the Great Twilight Zone. And Alfred Hitchcock often had really dark things that I liked. And I was always honored years later for Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho and wrote a lot of the things that were in the Hitchcock TV series. And he and I became friends. We weren't dear friends, but we became friends. And I got to meet Richard Matheson and associate with him. And I met Ray Bradbury, and he actually took me to lunch one time. All of that later in his life when he was in a wheelchair at that time. And I met William F. Nolan, who wrote Logan's Run and a lot of TV and stuff. And he and I became very good friends. And so I was fortunate. And Julie Schwartz, as I was saying, the comic book editor, all of these people, many, many more, I began to meet them. And so I was, those many years later, by the way, I was in hog heaven. I was meeting the people who had inspired me, and I was meeting people who wrote some of the movies that I love, because Matheson and Beaumont, they wrote a lot of those Vincent Price movies that Roger Corman made, and they wrote movies separate of one another. Robert Bloch wrote lots of screenplays, and Psycho, though he did not write the screenplay, was obviously based on his novel. So I had all these wonderful influences, and my mother would paint, and I was amazed at her ability to do that, because I had that inspiration to be an artist, but was terrible. I didn't have the knack. And so all of that kind of blended together. It wasn't a fruit salad, it was a blend. There's a difference. It's like in martial arts. If he grabs me, I'll use judo. If he does this, I'll use a wrist. That's not how it's done. It's actually a true blending, not a fruit salad. And that's the way the writing was. And in many ways, martial arts informed the way I approached the story and the way I wrote, whether I intended to or not.
Right. Bryan, before we get to talking about Bubba Ho-Tep, as a fellow Texan, what about the Texas art scene in particular has most spoken to you? Are there particular wells you've talked about, literary works, your family and things like that, but anything particular about Texas and growing up here and the evolution of things that have been happening.
When I was growing up, there was no art scene. There was no
Mm.
place to see art except on paperback covers. And those were great influences, you know, Roy Krinkle, Frazetta. I mean, you know, you could go on with a list of those people. They were the big influences for me on science fiction covers in particular, but also crime, like the gold medal novels and Westerns. All of those were the art that influenced me. And I had no, you know, there were no art museums. I mean, it was rare for me to get out of East Texas growing up. You know, until a certain period in my life, I had never been any farther north than Oklahoma, and no farther east than Louisiana, and no farther west than Arizona. And I did that when I was a kid, so I don't remember it all that well. My father and mother picked fruit and worked in vegetable not gardens, patches, fields where people pick cotton or vegetables. And they did that on their way out, where my father had what he thought was a job, but he didn't like it. And so they did it on the way back too. And I remember him going out in the woods and hunting squirrels for our dinner, you know, and that was a different. So there wasn't exactly an art scene, you know. there were no museums. There was nobody to tell you about art, and nobody that cared about art. They thought art was the guy that lived next door. There's just, you know, it wasn't like that. So the
Interesting.
paperback covers, and that was my entry, and the films and the TV and the books. And you know, I wasn't one of those kids that didn't get along with other kids or was an outsider. I was popular. I got along with people really well. I didn't have that trouble, but I always knew that I had a difference. I had a difference of way I looked at the world. And I lost my religion by the time I was probably 13, and completely understood that by the time I was 17. I was an atheist. I was more liberal minded than my neighbors, and I still am. But there's a lot more liberal people in Texas than others know, because unfortunately Texas is not so much a conservative state as it is a non-voting state. People just don't vote. You know that.
I do. I do.
Right. I was talking both of you, but talking to Preston, especially, he's in Texas. So, you know, it's just it. I mean, there's a lot more liberal minded people than you think. And it's so weird is that I moved out to Berkeley at one point before I was drafted, and nearly went to prison, which is another story. But when I moved out to Berkeley, I was going to go out there and be around all those liberal people, and some of them were, at least in voice, but I discovered that they were the same assholes everywhere. And that, you know, you had people that would lie to you, that would cheat. You had, I had so many fights growing up. I feel awful when I write in the memoir. I thought, well, this sounds like I'm just going around fighting. But I pretty much was, because I had real long hair down to here. And I sued TJC because they wouldn't let me come in because I had long hair. I won that suit. Me and some other guys. It was called Landsdale et al. Versus TJC. But, you know, I think that's what I learned, because really Texans, at least I can see that son of a bitch coming. I know this culture. And I also love the people that I love. And some of the people I love have totally different views than I do. But if my car broke down out here, they would stop and help me, you know. And in Berkeley, it'd be like when I was there, I wouldn't even get this. I wouldn't even get a wave. It'd just be zip. Of course, there's more of that changing here too. That's not as much as it was once before. But nonetheless, I know this culture and I know these people, and I'm fascinated by this culture. And I earned my place in this culture through fighting and through reading and through living, you know. And at some point I got to where I had enough money I didn't have to live on that lower rung, which is why a lot of fights happen. You're in these areas where there's a lot of frustrated, angry people, and it's like, how you doing? I'm going to kill you, you know. So before you know it, you're into it, you know.
Right now, I have to know, how did you almost end up in prison?
Well, I was opposed to the Vietnam War, and I had a deferment, and I went to some college. I never finished college. I really liked it, but I couldn't afford it. And so I decided at some point that I got a divorce. My first wife, we married when I was 18. By 19 and a half, I was divorced. And I didn't know it at the time, but I dodged a bullet, you know. And so, but I didn't want to be dodged in Vietnam, not because I didn't I'm one of those guys that I would not go as a conscientious objector, because I said, would you have gone to World War II? Yep. Would you fight if somebody fought you? Oh yeah. If you start it, I'm going to finish it. Not because I necessarily want to, but because I might have to, because you don't know where that's going to go. It could be you lying in a ditch with one shoe missing,
Mm-hmm.
So I was drafted, and I went and I refused to be inducted. And so they talked to me. They offered me officer training school, which, they'll offer you anything, and teaching martial arts at bases for the people that were in the military. And I said, well, I would still be supporting what I don't believe in. It's not the military I'm against. My brother retired as a captain from the military. I said, I don't believe in this war, and I don't think that the draft is a good idea. And when the war was over, we had 54,000 people killed, and Vietnam became one of our major trade partners, and people go there for vacation. And so nothing that they claim was true was true. We weren't fighting for that. We were just fighting for geography and for possibly oil and what we could get out of that. And it was the first time I'd truly become disillusioned with, people in power. I didn't become disillusioned with the country. I love it. I thought I was being a patriot. And when I didn't go back to school, I knew I was going to be drafted, and I knew I was going to go to prison. But when I went in the first time, they said, well, you go home and get your stuff in order and then come back on this date. And what you did, you went to Tyler, and you got on a bus, and they took you to Dallas to the draft board. And so when I got there the second time, I'm all down because I'm going to prison, and I'm not changing. You're not going to scare me. I'm not going to do it. Of course, I was scared, but I'm not going to let them know that. I'm not running, because I'm not running outside of this country. I'm an American. I love this country. Not doing that. I don't want a conscientious objector, because I don't feel that bill. It's sometimes I think it might be necessary to do that. Most of the time it isn't, but it might be necessary. And so they sent me in to see a psychiatrist that they had there. He gave me a 1Y, and they sent me home. And I remember being on the bus just dazed. And that was the end of my draft. And I didn't go to prison or go to Vietnam. So,
Oh, good.
I don't know. I think part of it was that I think it was about 1972, and the war ended was 74. And I think they were already starting to wind down. They also had somebody that was not, fitting their normal idea of what a draft dodger was, because I wasn't dodging. And on top of that, I was willing to go to prison, and I sincerely thought I was. I never occurred to me that they would say to me, go home and have a good life, is what the psychiatrist said to me as I was going to the door.
Wow.
And I remember, there was a guy with a red sash there, a military guy, and he whispered to me, go to Canada, son, this isn't working. And I said, no, I'm not running. And I remember those two things. So I think you were starting to see a lot of infiltration of ideas that were somewhat different. Probably people who had been there, or known people who had been there. I knew that we were going to pull out, so why add more to it? So I don't know, but whatever, I was fortunate. And later, when I thought about dropping out to be drafted, trying to make this political statement, I thought, you idiot. I should have gone to college. But I was thinking about all those, poor people, black people and stuff who were fighting those wars. And then one day I realized, hell, I'm one of the poor people. What was I thinking,
Oh my goodness. What an incredible story. And in conjunction with the psychiatrist saying, go on and lead a good life, and having these different ideas, let's bring that to Bubba Ho-Tep, because out of all the movies in the world, out of all the film and cinema experiences, the one movie that I most love explaining and talking about to people is Bubba Ho-Tep. Oh my gourd. So seriously, it's the one movie I love. It's like, what is this movie about? And I get to explain it to them. It's the movie I love to most talk about. How did this story come into your brain?
My brother's wife, Mary, they met in Memphis, and she graduated high school with Elvis. So she knew him, and my brother met him. This was before he was Elvis. He was starting to be Elvis. And my brother would cross paths with him from time to time. But the first time he met him was in Lowe's Theater, and Elvis was an usher with a flashlight, and he showed you to your seat. His hair was still brown, blondish almost. He dyed it black later. But he said that he said, but I tell you what, there was just something about that guy. He said, that guy's got something. It's not, I can't figure out what it is, but this guy's got something. And he's an usher, And then the next thing you know, he's a king of rock and roll, you know. And my brother tried to record at Sun Records. He did record something that wasn't successful. It never. I think you could go in and get recordings done, you know. And the guy Sam Phillips liked it, but somebody else recorded it and they liked that one better. And my brother ended up going into the military, went in the Marines, then got out of the Marines and went into the Army and retired a captain. But he always was interested in music and wanted to be in music. So one time he went to a school for, I guess you call them radio announcers. Back then that was a big thing because you didn't have all the television and internet stuff we have now. So he was sitting in a chair talking to this other guy, and they were both talking about how desperate they were financially and that they needed to get some job. And this other guy was trying to get an announcing job. And it turned out that was Johnny Cash, but he wasn't Johnny Cash yet. And so I'm tying this all in to the Elvis thing. Believe me, trust me. And then later, my daughter's was recorded, and she's a professional singer and songwriter. She was recorded by Johnny's son, John Carter Cash, who is one hell of a great guy, you know. And so we had kind of that full circle. But I had this Elvis aspect, and I was a big fan. I grew up. I remember when I was a little kid hearing him on the radio and going, "What the hell's that? That's not Hank Snow. What is that?" You know. And you just sort of caught moving around, you know, you start to understand what's going on here. But so I loved Elvis. Well, John Kennedy was president when I was a child, and he was assassinated. And at that time, you know, we felt as Americans after World War II that we were perfect. We weren't, but we felt we were. But we were pretty good. You know, we were the world's hero for quite a while there. In some ways, you know, even in spite of all the crap, still are, right or wrong. I think rightly, ultimately. But he was killed, and it was just such a blow. You know, it was just such a blow because he was about education and science. And at that time, religion and education were separate. You didn't mix them together. It was not allowed. You could go to church for your education. You went to, for your religious education, and you went to school for your real education, for I'm concerned. But after Elvis and John Kennedy, you know, John Kennedy was killed and Elvis's arrival, those were big impacts on me. And then later in life, my mother had a car accident, which put her in a rest home because she had to be taken care of 24/7. And so I spent lots of time there, you know. At that time, we all thought she was going to come out of it, but it didn't work out that way. But I listened to people talk. I was around different people in that rest home. And you know, that passed. And in my mind, I'd always had a funny title called Bubba Ho-Tep that I thought I'd write a story around someday. And then I was asked to write a story for Elvis is Dead, I think it was called, or The King is Dead. I forget exactly. And all of that just blended together suddenly. I wrote it very quick. It was, I don't remember exactly how long, a week or two at the most, because it was a long story. And for me, that was actually longer than usual, but it was still quick. And when I turned it in, I thought, what have I done? That story is crazy. I was going to write and withdraw it, and I waited a few days, and I got a letter back. They loved it. Favorite story in the book. So then suddenly I thought it was pretty good. And Don Coscarelli one time called me and said, "Can I come visit with you a few days?" And I said, "Okay." You know, I didn't know him from Adam. I knew who he was. I knew what he had done. I was a fan of Phantasm. And he came to the house and stayed for us a couple of days. And he was looking for, try to option some of my work. And I think some of it was already under option, so I wasn't able to do that. But he went away thinking he wanted to do something of mine. And then later he came across an anthology of mine that had Bubba Ho-Tep in it, or a collection of mine had Bubba Ho-Tep in it, and Incident on and Off a Mountain Road. And he liked them both. And when he was going to option Bubba, I said, "Don, you're a friend. Don't do it. You can't make this into a film. It won't work." And I remember telling my brother, of all the things I've written, I know one thing that'll never be filmed, Bubba Ho-Tep. And then he said, "Do you want to write a script?" Well, Don doesn't pay a lot, so I didn't want to write a script because I didn't think it could be done, was a real reason. And then he sent me a script, and I said, "Well, that son of a bitch, he did it." You know, and I think I had a few suggestions, which he ignored until Bruce Campbell had the same ones. Then it was a good suggestion. And then they made the film, and my son and I went out there on the set for a few days, and I became friends with Bruce, we're still friends. And Don, of course, and I just became real close. And I got to meet Ossie Davis, one of my heroes. So it was a wonderful experience, but it was just an unexpected, unlikely experience. And when I first saw it, I saw it in Austin because Don came to Austin, and we saw it with the guy that did some kind of news thing, something about comics and film and whatever. But he was there. I brought a friend with me, and we watched it. And I was thinking, oh, this is gonna suck, and it didn't suck. I said, damn, this is good, because he did almost the story verbatim, and what changes he has mainly had to do with finances, and then he added a few things that aren't in the story, but they work beautifully. And he couldn't afford, in my story, it was kind of like these weird shadows that fluttered around the mummy, but he turned that into that bug, the big cockroach.
The size of my fist.
Yeah. And so they kind of took the place of that, which I thought was brilliant, because I remember being scared they wouldn't do the thing where the mummy would talk and it would come out in hieroglyphics, but they did. And that made me very happy, because that's in the book. And those hieroglyphics were made by Mark Nelson, who gets a credit at the end of the film.
Awesome.
He did them for my book. Hey, he did them for my book, then he did them in the film.
Oh, that's so cool.
That's Bubba.
That's amazing. Not to get too incredibly deep, but I think part of the reason why I love this particular film, by the way, this is one of our first episodes of My Bloody Podcast that Bryan and I do, was Bubba Ho-Tep. I want to say it was like episode 3.
Yeah, it was yeah. And we've done over 120 or 130 episodes, so we
yeah, I would be embarrassed to go back and listen to it, so don't look it up. Anyway, what makes it so great is that while, as you were describing it, it's like a very ridiculous concept, but what makes it so great is just like there's a lot of great comedy in it, and then there's a lot of realism to it, and I kind of want to tap into that realism a little bit.
Well, that goes back to my literary influence days. I thought I was writing a story that would be fun on the surface, but was really about mortality and about growing old, and how when growing old, you're often disrespected.
Yeah. And
of course, here I am old now, and I was writing that, and I guess I was 40, maybe, I don't know, 40s, early 40s. And but being around that rest home, and of course my mother was older, and my father was gone by then, and I felt a lot about that while I was writing. It was going on while I was writing it, so I know that infused into it. And I often write stories that are just fun, but more often than not, stories I write have to do with something or another. If you look at it and you read it carefully, you go, oh, I see what he's getting at. And some of the best ways to do that are fantasy, science fiction, horror, and even crime fiction, different ways of approaching it. So that was the essence of the story to me. That was its heartbeat, was that, facing mortality and what life is about, and how do you deal with it? What's it worth? How do you make it worth something?
Yeah, that the line, everything you do is worthless and sadly amusing, is the one that I cling to the most. Of course, I'm not not quite there yet, but I am curious, just because you brought it up, how has your relationship changed to the themes over the past 30, 40 years?
I feel exactly the same. When I was in my mid-20s, I really kind of had the whole mortality thing and understood it. And it hadn't changed. And I think being an atheist has a lot to do with it. It is what it is. It's not like you're going to avoid it. It's not like I'm waiting for the promised land. It's not like I think somebody put us here for a test, and if they did, they're a jackass. And so I didn't change. I felt that way. I still feel that way. I'm happy. I live a good life, but I'm very much aware that things change, and you get older, things change. Fortunately for me, I'm still working. I'm still capable. So I'm still teaching martial arts, for heaven's sakes. I hurt more, but I'm still teaching. But I just think that you have to look at it straight on, and once you look at it straight on, you're a lot more comfortable.
Yeah. I had to ask just because you were talking about Old Man in the Sea earlier.
Yeah,
and I had a different brain to you. Yeah,
it's a good question.
No, I love it. If so, since the whole worldwide phenomenon of Bubba Ho-Tep, and there's been talks for a long time about Bubba Nosferatu, if you can add that Bubba character into any movie to make it that much more better, do you know what movie? Any movie that you would add that Bubba Ho-Tep universe into?
Bubba, Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid.
Sold. Where do
What a
I send the
statement of
check?
Butch Cassidy and Casablanca.
I love it. I love it. I have a couple of fun questions for you. First off, is it true that in some time when you were growing up, that part of a space shuttle landed in your backyard or front
Well, it
yard?
wasn't when I was growing up. I was a grown man. It was the space shuttle was in the 2000s. You know, it exploded over our East Texas and over our house to some degree because debris landed in the yard. And we called in and they said, well, just, preserve it, don't move it. And we went to town and there was debris in town. I remember in the bank parking lot, there was the door to the space shuttle, and they found body parts and stuff like that. All out in the woods. And because, East Texas is deep woods. It's nothing like people think of as Texas. It's more like Louisiana. It's got swamp, rivers, creeks, lots of woods, lots of critters. And so that happened. I can't remember the exact year that happened, but that's not ancient history by any means. And I was a grown man. Yeah, and the kid, what happened is that when it exploded, we were asleep. We were in bed. And I don't think it was real early or anything, but we were still in bed and it felt suddenly like the earthquake. The house started rumbling and I heard what I sounded like a giant semi at the end of our long drive, just sitting there idling. And then there was that, and the house literally shook. And I got up and went outside. I didn't see anything, and at that first glance. And then Karen's brother called and said, did you find any pieces of the space shuttle? I thought, what? And so it had blown up and we did find them in the yard and they eventually came and collected them. And but there were pieces around town. And like I said, a whole door lined up in the bank parking lot.
Oh my goodness.
And I heard somebody had a piece went right through their truck, but nobody was hurt. Nobody was in it. And so I don't know how people managed not to get hit or hurt, but they didn't, except of course the poor astronauts. But
right.
That's true. But
that's crazy. And I have to know that
there were no space shuttles when I was a kid. That's how young you are.
I'm in my 40s.
Yeah, right. And later, and that was Russian. And then later they landed on the moon, but no, that was much later.
Okay. And I have to ask, so in all of your years of writing and maybe collecting books, do you have what is your most curious, your most odd publication that you own? And do you hold it in high prize? Like the most curious or odd?
I can't think of anything like that at all. I have a vast book collection, which I'm getting rid of a lot now because I've run out of house. I've got like a 4,000 square foot house and I only use the upstairs, which is half the house. And I got bookshelves everywhere and they're stuffed full of books and they're starting to outrun me. And as fast as I get rid of them, though, I'll buy a few more. I try to say, well, if I get rid of 500, I can buy 10. But I don't really know. I don't know if I have. I'm sure I do have some really unique items, but I don't think about that at all. Some of my stuff has appeared in odd places too, but even that I'd really have to dig and think about. So I don't think I have an answer to that question.
All right. Well, at a later time for sure.
Maybe.
Yeah, when you're cleaning it out, let us know.
That's it. I don't know if I'm what the hell is this? I have a lot of comics stuff. I have all kinds of things.
That's cool. And so it's obvious that you're a literary and a cinematic aficionado. Are there any particular scenes in movies or passages in books that have always stuck with you that help shape you creatively?
Yeah, the opening to Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something about it was 10 o'clock in the morning with a high, hard look of rain in the foothills. And I was dressed in my powder blue suit and my striped tie, and I was clean and sober and didn't care who knew it, or something along that line. I'm sure I left out words, but I just remember that telling me immediately I knew that character. One paragraph. I thought, oh, what can I learn from that? And Ray Bradbury talking about out there in the deep, in the Foghorn, and so many things of his, so many things by so many writers. Twain. Oh my God, everything by Twain. He was just brilliant. Huckleberry Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird are my two favorite novels. And my sentimental favorite is A Princess of Mars by Burroughs. And some of those things are certainly dated. They're not going to pass the muster of modern times exactly, but I don't think you read them for that. You read them for what they do. Like some people, well, Lovecraft was racist. We got to get rid of him. Well, I don't read him for his racism. I read him for his creativity and what he did, what he accomplished. If he were alive now, I probably wouldn't read him because I wouldn't want him to get my money. But right now, he's not getting my money, and he's getting it for a different reason. He's getting it for the fact that he created a lot of the horror field that reject him, which is kind of a more recent thing, wouldn't have a horror field if it weren't for him. Or Edgar Allan Poe, who was a drinker and a doper. And, if you get into if a person's alive and I can keep them from getting an income and I don't like them, I can make that choice personally. I'm not saying they should be, canceled or restricted or censored. They get to say whatever they want, even if I think it's idiotic. I'm not a fan of this sort of let's go back and revise everything. Because you lose the history, you lose the context, you actually lose how much we have accomplished. Because when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, racism was so raw. Jim Crow was so raw. It's nothing like now. So it's much, much better. Can we do better? Of course. But you also need that context of the past. Not that we learn much from it, but we should try.
Right. And since you're part of
Brian
this,
and I know what. Sorry, Brian. Brian and I know what we're going to get you for Christmas. We're going to get you black wool socks with dark blue clocks on them.
That's right. That's what he had on. That's what he had on. Yeah.
Yeah.
He would. There's scenes where he'd have his feet propped. But I always thought Chandler was so funny, and yet at the same time, he was writing crime novels, but he was also writing real novels. He was writing novels. He was doing what I wanted to do. Was write a genre in one way, but write literary stuff in another way, and you don't really have to define it, but that's what he was doing. And that influenced me heavily. Ray Bradbury was doing the same, especially that real early stuff. He was writing horror and science fiction or science fantasy, but he was also writing literary allegories. And I love that. Flannery O'Connor, she was actually a Catholic writer, but her work came across not that way to me at all. I thought that she could see hypocrisy better than almost anybody, and she did it straight on. She wouldn't try. I might offend somebody. She didn't care if she offended you. And I think writing should be brave and offensive if it needs to be. It's not always about what you think; it's about what the characters think. And I've had racist characters in my books, but I'm not a racist. I'm using them to make a point or to capture an element in time that exists. And I just get tired of everything being sugar-coated now, or I don't do trigger warnings. And the only one I do is I wrote it. That's my trigger warning. And the other thing is I don't do that because I don't know what might offend you. Well, if I make a list of 10, but it's the other two things that offend you, well, I did a poor job at a trigger warning. I have no idea what will offend you. And life's just full of little disappointments. And I think people have to get used to that to live a good life. And outside of Twitter, most people don't give a damn anyway. They're not going to, I'm going to say something. I might say something that'll trigger you. Well, that rarely happens unless it's amongst a group that are always constantly afraid they're going to hurt somebody's feelings or offend somebody. Nobody should want to hurt somebody's feelings or offend them, but you do. Because that's life, and literature is not about that. It's not about pretty manners. It's not at all.
Yeah. Well said.
Well said. To end this convo, I could feel like we could talk with you for 2 hours, and hopefully we'll have you back on the show very soon. But I'm curious, you're part of this Mount Rushmore of creativity with some of the best names out there. Let's say, so do you, Joe, have like a text chain or an email chain with Don or Stephen King or anybody that you've worked with where you talk about movies and books or UFC fighting, boxing?
I don't know Stephen King well. We know who each other is, and I know his sons better actually. I know Owen and Joe, and I know King because I met him, and we know each other kind of in passing, that sort of way. But yeah, a lot of the people I do keep. Every once in a while I drop Bruce Campbell a line, or James Purefoy, who played Hap in the TV series, and I consider all those people friends. There's levels of friendship. There's casual friendship, and then there's deep friendship, and it varies from people I know. Don just sent me a new poster for Bubba Ho-Tep a little while back, and actually sent me a really cool bathrobe because he thought, man, this is cool. You need one of these. He and his wife, and so yeah, I keep up with a lot of people like that, not as well as I should sometimes because I'm so busy, and our kids have grown up both to be writers. My son's had some movies done from his scripts, and Casey's done, good grief. She's a professional singer, songwriter. She has a book company called Pandy Press, her and her fiance, Jonathan Levitt, who is a major magician. He's one of the great sleight of hand magicians, and he works out at the Magic Castle a lot, but all over. They just did. They were 2.5 months in Italy, and she was doing book signings, and he was doing magic, and they were doing tourism too, and got engaged. So it was they were busy.
Congrats.
So it's a good life. We hang out mostly. And I travel when I have to. I write every day. I've already written today, and it's what I wanted. I think I'm one of the, I've had tragedy in my life, and I've had disappointments in my life, like most anybody who lives a full life, but I got what I wanted. I knew what I wanted early on, and I got it, and I'm not complaining. I don't have to be the richest writer, though I'm well enough off that I can't believe it. Starting from being so poor, I can pretty much do what I want, afford what I want. And then yet again, I'm not so much that way that I want to quit working. Even if I wanted to quit working, I still like having that security, because Dean Koontz once said to me one time, he said, once poor, always poor. He's right.
Well, that grass for free.
That's amazing. I love it. Thank you so much, Joe. You're going to be at the Texas Theater September 9th for a screening of Bubba Ho-Tep.
And I'm also signing Things Get Ugly, a collection of crime stories.
Awesome. We can't wait to see you at the Texas Theater here in Dallas, Texas, a historic theater, an amazing theater. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope to have you on very soon again.
Okay, I'm here. All right, take care.
Thank you.
Okay.